Jan Cannon, it is an honour to have you on the Finding Hope podcast today. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, goodness. It's an honour for me to be here. Thank you.
Jan, tell me a little bit about yourself. The first question I generally ask guests is, how would you introduce yourself to a stranger? If someone you didn't know came up to you, what would you say?
I'd say, hello, my name is Jan, and I've, the way that you sum up my life is never a dull moment. And at the moment, I'm caring for my 4 grandchildren in New Zealand, which is a very full life.
Wow, that's
Mm.
incredible. So I assume your children, did they move over to New Zealand?
Oh, it's a really complicated story. Yes, basically, yes.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, very glad that you're on a little bit of a trip back here in Australia and you get to speak to me. Very, very excited.
Yes.
Jan, y- probably the thing you're most well known for is you were the first woman on commercial FM radio in Australia. Such a
That's right.
pioneer for so many people like me. Did you always want to work in radio or media, or was it something you fell into?
Um, well, I'd always wanted to be a star. I really loved Shirley Temple when I was growing up, and I thought possibly I could step into her shoes, but that didn't become the way. You know, I have to tell you that the word hope really has an enormous influence in my life. And the reason I say that is because when I was about 5 or 6 years old, my father, who was an organic chemist, took us to a little place on the south coast of Western Australia near a town called Hopetown. Now, I know there's a Hopetown in Victoria as well, but there's a Hope Town on the southwest west coast of Western Australia as well. And it's really significant because it is actually the most biodiverse stratosphere in the southern hemisphere. There's a national park there now called the Fitzgerald River National Park. But when we needed to top up our supplies, we would drive over East Mount Barron and go down to Hope Town. And one day I was playing at the playground there, and I met a girl who said to me, "Have you ever listened to the Argonauts?" And I said, "The what?" And she said, "Oh, you got to listen on the radio to the Argonauts." And that was my introduction to radio, and I fell in love with it then, and it became my best companion all through the rest of my early days, through my teenage years. And I virtually knew everything about radio by the time I was finishing school. And when I heard that there was a job being advertised at my favourite radio station, which was 6 p.m, I immediately rang and asked if I could have an interview. And I was granted an interview, which is awesome, along with about 200 other girls. So, but somehow, miraculously, I got the job. So, yeah, and I started off as a hitline chick. So,
What is that?
well, I was placed in the control room of the radio station with 7 telephones, and they would ring at me constantly. And when the announcer on the air said something like, be the 21st caller through and you'll get the tickets to the ABBA show, I had to take 21 phone calls, and that person was the lucky one that got it.
Wow.
Oh, and of
So you're
course,
like a phone producer.
well, no, not even. I was just the girl that answered the phones,
Right.
and slowly but surely became a bit of an identity at the radio station. Because one day I rolled in, and I'd unfortunately stepped on a bee, and my foot was very swollen. And the guy who was on air said, "Why don't we call you Lumpy?" And and somebody said, no, a better overall description would be chunky. And that stuck. And I was chunky for 4 years until on the 1st of January 1980, when by this time I had my own 6-hour program on a Saturday evening, I decided to go on air and introduce myself as Jan Cannon. And I had all these people ringing up going, "Where's Chunky? We want Chunky." It's like, "What's me?"
Did you have to revert to the nickname, or you stuck to your guns? You're
Well,
like, no, I'm Jan Cannon.
no, what I did was I kind of like, sort of slowly but surely deleted Chunky, so like maybe once every 4 breaks I would say Chunky, and then after a while it was like once every 2, and then after a while it was nothing. So, yeah, people got used to the fact that Jan Cannon was actually Chunky.
Jan, what was it about radio? You said it was your best companion throughout your life. What was it that drew you to it?
Um, well, my father was a very um, stoic, stern academic. My mother was a high school teacher, and I had 2 younger brothers, and one of them had special needs. And so and there was a lot of expectation placed upon me to do well at school. And so, I think I've always I must have been born with a rock and roll gene, I think, somewhere in amongst that, which, was pretty concerning to my parents because they brought us up on classical music. Um, so, when I could sneak away into my bedroom and to do my homework or whatever it was I was doing, cleaning up, usually cleaning my room took me about 8 hours. Um, I would put the radio on and listen to it, and I just loved it. I loved the songs. I loved what the guys were talking about. I loved the fact that I could hear what was happening in the world. And I just loved the whole concept of theatre of the mind. And there were things that happened on the radio which just stimulated my imagination, and I loved it.
Yeah, that's amazing. Now, what do you remember your first broadcast? What it was like?
Oh, do I ever?
Yeah, tell me about it, please.
So, as I told you, I was a hitline chick. So I rolled into the radio station one afternoon at the time that I started, which was usually around about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And the program manager came up to me, and it was Rocktober, and said to me, "Oh, by the way, you're going to take over the radio station this afternoon." And I went, "What?"
Oh
He
my
goes,
goodness,
"Yep.
just like that.
You're going to go into that studio where a guy called Sam West was broadcasting, and you are going to sit down there and you're going to kick Sam out of the studio. That's going to be your job for this afternoon." Um, and I couldn't believe it. So I tried every trick in the book that I could, told terrible, dad jokes as they're known now. Um, I chatted over the top of him. I went and got my favourite records and made him play them. I mean, I just did whatever I could. And he didn't budge. He didn't go. But it was very entertaining radio. So
Oh,
yeah,
that's
that was
amazing.
my
Now,
first one.
eventually, you became the first woman
Mm.
to broadcast on commercial FM radio. Can you share a little bit about that experience?
Yeah. So I there was a book called On the Beach by Neville Shute, and in that, a nuclear bomb is dropped on the Earth, and there's only one person, as far as anybody knows, who survives, and it's a guy in a radio station. And so I thought, well, what if that was to happen? And I was the only one left, and I didn't know how to operate the radio station. That'd be terrible. So when things got I used to work through until midnight, and things would usually quieten off around about 10 o'clock at night, something like that. So I'd take myself off to the spare studio, and basically I taught myself how to do what the guys on the air were doing.
Wow.
And there was a fellow called Trevor Smith who was part of an organisation which programmed all the major capital city radio stations at the time. It was called Digame, and Trevor happened to be in the radio station, and I said to him, I used to record myself. I used to make air checks, and I said to him, "Would you mind having a listen to this so that I can, you can tell me how I can get better?" And that one, incident led to a sort of an ongoing kind of regular thing. And when FM was about to start in Australia in 1980, he contacted me and said, "Would you like to come and live in Melbourne?" And I went, "Too right, I'd love to." So, and the really funny part to this story is that I was at an announcers meeting not long before this happened, and the program manager, a guy called Leo Nelson, was looking at all of the guys on air, completely ignored me, just left me out of the picture, and said to them all, "Now you're going to get offers to go and work at the commercial FM stations that are about to start. I want you to think really carefully about it, whether you would take it or not." I don't know what those other guys were thinking, but I was thinking if I ever got offered, I'd go for it. And that's what happened. I was the first one to be offered, actually. So,
Wow. That's
yeah.
amazing. All right, and so uh, did these stations did they all start? Well, they all would have started at kind of like periodically at different times.
Well,
Is that correct?
they
Like
all
over a series of
yeah,
months?
they sort of all started in the latter part of 1980, and as I've already said, Eon was the first one on, then 2 Day, and I don't really know what was happening in any of the other capitals, but I know that when I eventually got to 96 FM, they were very, very careful in their start. They were led by a guy called Gary Roberts, and Gary made sure everything was in place perfectly before he switched on the button to say that they were on air. And they ended up being number one for 10 years, for the first 10 years that they were on air.
Eon.
No, 96 FM
Oh,
in
90.
Perth.
Right.
So they really made a really good no, Eon struggled. So they wanted to be really different from what 3XY was offering, and so they said to us all, "Hey, just play your favourite album tracks, go and whatever you wanna play, just play it." And it didn't take long for us to realise that that wasn't actually a winning formula because it was basically like there was, 6 different radio stations happening in the space of 24 hours because we all had different music tastes. So eventually it became a lot more commercial than what it was in the early days.
Yeah. Can you share, just because we've got the mic levels now, can you
Mm.
share a little bit more about that? Yeah, that first experience. You came on at about 2 a.m. 2 a.m. at Eon.
That's
Uh,
yeah,
uh,
yes.
How did it all start?
Okay, so for me, I'd got to the radio station about 11 o'clock at night because I knew I'd be doing from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. That was the shift they'd given me. Um, And at midnight, the switch was flicked, and Peter Grace was the first person to speak on commercial FM in Australia. And he played a song called A New Kid in Town by the Eagles. And it was really because it was all about the fact that there was a brand new radio station starting. And then I hung around and watched what he was doing because I kind of wanted to do what he was doing. Felt really like completely out of my comfort zone. And then at 2 a.m., he left the studio. Incidentally, the studio was like an office. It was like an office, like what you would find with melamine walls and that kind of thing. And we'd hung hessian over the walls to absorb some of the sound. And everything. And I was sitting at a really makeshift radio desk with two turntables that kind of wriggled every time someone walked on the floor. The needle would jump on on the record and all that sort of stuff. Anyway, fortunately, there's not too many people around at 2 o'clock in the morning, and I sat down and I started off my time on commercial FM with a commercial-free hour, thanks to Copper Kettle Coffee. And I was so nervous, and just as well I like doing tongue twisters. Otherwise, I could have, really messed that up. But I practiced and practiced, so I didn't mess it up.
Oh wow,
Yeah.
that's amazing. Do you remember the first song that you played?
No, I don't. I wish I did, but I
No,
don't.
no, no, that's all right.
Mm.
Well, you've already touched on some of the challenges of being a woman in radio at that time. And,
Yeah.
historically, and I feel like still to this day in media, sometimes there is a bit of a boys' club.
Mm.
How were you taken seriously? How did you get to that point where you're like, no, like I'm Jan Cannon. You need to, yeah,
Yeah.
listen to me. I deserve to be here.
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing is that a very brave program manager by the name of John Burnley decided he wanted to do something a little bit different on a Saturday night when I was at 6 p.m. And he started a show called 80 Album Hits in a Row, which became known as 80 Chunks in a Row after a while. But and all I was allowed to say was the name of the station, the time, and the name of the show. But I mean, for 4 hours, it's so boring.
So
So,
boring.
of course, I would throw things in every here and there. And of course, I'd already been practicing for several months by this stage, so I kind of knew what I was doing. And it really took off. People loved it. And 3 weeks later, the general manager heard me on the air, and because they had a policy of no females on the air. I didn't even know that. I don't think John knew that either. And so this fellow turned to John and said, "Get her off." And John said, "I can't. It's working. People love it." So that's how I got to actually stick on the air. And yeah, I guess the fact that it worked, and it went from being a 4-hour commercial free program to then being a 6-hour program from 6 p.m. until midnight on a Saturday night with 18 minutes of commercials. I don't know if you can imagine what that's like, but that's a third of the hour basically taken up with
Yeah.
commercials. Um, I felt like an octopus, I was just flying here and there, throwing things into the machines and, queuing up records. Because back in those days, of course, nothing was digital. It was
Yeah.
all manual. Yeah, and I could do it, and I did it, and I did it very well. And I had this philosophy in my mind that, if I was going to make it, I not only had to be as good as the guys, I had to be better than them. And so I was constantly listening to sources of good radio, and, hearing lines that worked, and I would use them. And eventually I developed my own particular um, style, I guess you could say. But it's like any good artist, it's a bit of this, a bit of that, a bit of the next thing, from the various people that I heard that I admired and thought did a really wonderful job of communicating on the radio. And I guess because I developed my own style and I rated number one in Perth, I rated number one in Melbourne. What more, the evidence, the data speaks for itself, so to speak. So yeah,
Yeah.
and then people started to realise, because one of the lines I used to get told all the time before I started on the radio was, "Look, women don't like listening to women on the radio, so I don't know why you're wasting your time." I
I
was like, "Yeah, but what
sometimes
if there's
still
a?"
get told that.
Do
Like,
you? Oh,
not by,
oh, yeah.
anyone of note, but it's I think it's stuck. It's like, "Oh, people prefer male voices on the radio." It's like, okay."
I don't. It's just so not true. I mean, I think what we all prefer is somebody who is sincere, authentic, and has a good message. And it doesn't matter if it's a male voice or a female voice, in my opinion.
Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe for all future Finding Hope episodes. In the meantime, enjoy these videos.